anytime someone releases a new camera, it's always exciting to see what the new latest and greatest things are. The Canon R5C has been rumored for quite some time, but today was the release of the actual specs and a few more details. So let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Canon R5C. So we'll start with the good things. Things that I think about. No recording time limits. Canon for years has been having this system that are 30-minute record limit or 29:59 record limit, which most of us never understood. I assume that with the R5 it had to do with the overheating potentially, but they had this on previous cameras as well, so kudos to Canon for finally getting rid of that. In addition, of course, with the R5C, the first thing we notice is the fan that's been added, and so this should lead to no overheating problems. Yes, there'll be additional noise and things like that, but I think that's pretty minimal considering several other manufacturers have done this, including Panasonic with the S1H and also obviously Sony with the FX3. So I think this is a good move on their part to eliminate overheating. The third thing is, of course, this new power switch that they have, which is basically 3 positions from off, photo, and then video. On the photo side, it's pretty traditional, it seems, from what we can see, is that you're going to be able to take photos like you always would, which is like with an R5. But when you switch over to video, you're going to really be in the video mode, which has the cinema menus and the cinema system that many in the Canon world are used to. So it's nice to see that they've moved ahead and actually created a mode that really makes sense for the video users out there. Now, when you're in that video mode, you're going to get many of those cinema features that cameras are used to seeing, like false color and waveform and things like that. I'm not sure how many people actually will utilize this on the displays that come with the camera. My experience has been that they're pretty small and hard to read oftentimes, and so that's why so many of us usually move to having an external display for those false color and waveforms. It's more readable, but perhaps it is nice to have if you're a run and gun and you don't want to have an external monitor. The other thing that they have added onto this that really I haven't seen much hype about is the addition of Timecode. For those who are using Timecode in a true video production environment and want to use this more like a cinema camera, having Timecode is a really nice option for syncing up audio and things in post-production. The other thing that we're kind of seeing and hearing out there is that it's kind of a dual ISO system at 800 and 3200 in C-Log3. Now, they haven't really promoted this as a true dual ISO system, and they certainly never talked about it in the R5 to my knowledge, but it does appear like there's something happening. Whether or not that's truly a dual ISO or if it's really just some kind of noise reduction or oversampling or something that's doing well there, I'm not sure. The great thing about this also is that you're going to have that great R5 autofocus. So if you have worked with a C70, you know that the autofocus is one of the complaints that many users had, that it didn't have as good of autofocus as what people were seeing in the R5. So with the R5C, our expectation is it's going to use that same autofocus technology, and we should see a vast improvement over the C70's autofocus, which is a big selling point for a lot of users out there. I know there's this push to think that true cinematographers don't use autofocus, but as time moves on, I think we're really seeing that autofocus is a useful technology for not only videoing yourself, but also for, using it in true production as well. And finally, of course, the thing that shouldn't go overlooked is 8K 60 RAW, which is an incredible format to be able to use. We can talk about whether or not how useful that is, but the fact is this camera is going to output 8K 60 RAW. So let's talk about the wrongs, the bad things, the things that aren't as good. Number one is that, and I think you're going to hear this from a lot of people, there's no C-Log2. And of course, in pure Canon fashion, the rumor mill is going to be that they're just protecting their cinema lines. And there's probably some truth to that, but I think this is an interesting limitation that they've put out there. C-Log2, if you're not familiar with it, has always been sort of the profile that gets you maximum dynamic range. Until I know that there's RAW, but at the same time, the users out there who are familiar with working with log formats and like the size and dynamic range and flexibility that C-Log2 could offer are really being limited now with that dynamic range of only having C-Log3 available from that perspective. The The other one is no IBIS. So the R5 was always touted as having such great IBIS on the sensor that they've completely removed it from this camera, which is very traditional for their cinema lines. What they are including is their electronic stabilization, which others have used on the other cinema lines, and it seems to be pretty good, but I think that I'm really kind of surprised that there is no in-body image stabilization that was left in this camera. Seems like something that would have been logical since it already existed in the R5 lineup. The other thing is the dreaded micro HDMI. I don't know, Sony does a full-size HDMI on many of their products, Panasonic as well. Canon, you gotta step up your game with the HDMI. Many folks who are using external monitors or external recorders or external displays of any kind, we just all hate micro HDMI. It's easy to break, easy to pull out, easy to be faulty over time, and it just makes sense to have a full-size HDMI in a product like this, it seems to me. The other one that really wasn't a surprise to me is that there are no integrated ND filters. But I will say that because they took out IBIS, I'm a little bit surprised that maybe ND filters didn't come in to play or become an option. Without the IBIS, you know, that usually is the reason they don't include IBIS in the full cinema lines, is because of the ND filter built-in problems. So the fact that they removed IBIS and still didn't put ND filters was a bit of a surprise as well. I think another disadvantage is actually also the card slot layout. So there's a CF Express and then a standard SD card slot, and yes, you can do V90 SD cards, but the mismatched slot types really doesn't make it easy to do a true dual recording. Yes, you can record one format to one card and another format to another card, but it just seems like it would have been logical for them to include the same kind of card slots. One of the kudos I will give to Sony with their CF Express Type A slots in the A7S III and the FX3 is that they're the same type of card slot, so it makes it easy to dual record to those two card slots with exactly the same. I do understand that it's possible that with the 8K 60 raw idea that CF Express was needed, but I think sacrificing that to have similar card slots would have been beneficial for most of the folks who are using this camera for content creation. The other thing is the battery limitations. So they're using the standard R5 style battery, and based on what we're seeing with the addition of the 8K 60 RAW, the addition of the fan, and all of the things that we're seeing is that this is going to be a battery chewer. You're going to lose tons of battery life, and you're going to have a pocket full of these batteries to really make them last or be able to use the camera the way you would expect. The other thing is no XLRs built into the camera. If you remember, the C70 had the mini XLR, which was nice to have on board. And Canon's not even really creating their own XLR solution through the hot shoe adapter. They've actually started to promote the Tascam version of this, which is $500. And not that that price is bad, but it's just interesting that Canon has decided not to create their own, but to go ahead and promote the Tascam version of this. Now, let's talk about price. You know, in the grand scheme of the R5, the R5C and the C70, you're looking at $4,500 versus $3,500 and $5,500. So it does fall nicely in between those other product lines. The addition of that Tascam unit, you're looking at somewhere around the $5,000 price mark. So kind of falls in between there. It's a little bit pricier than maybe some expected, but I think it probably falls in line with what we're seeing out there. So let's talk just a little bit about how does it compare to the C70. Well, certainly the R5C is going to have much better autofocus than the C70. So if you're trying to think about it from that perspective, I think the R5C is certainly a better choice in that regard. Also, I think we should think about the fact that it's full frame versus Super 35. And so when it comes to good low light performance, as far as also depth of field and things like that, then if you're a full frame user and you like that full frame look, then there is an advantage in that regard. I do think it's unfortunate that they don't have C-Log 3 to be able to really get that dynamic range that the C70 has, but we've already talked about that. One advantage the C70 certainly has is the built-in ND filters and the mini XLR ports. I think you can't go forward without talking about that there is certainly that advantage of having built-in ND filters, that convenience of never having to screw on and off lens-based NDs, and the built-in mini XLRs are certainly nice as it's all integrated and it's easy to just plug directly in. One thing that's often not talked about as well for those out there who are SDI users is that the C70 has built-in SDI as well. The other thing is the C70 battery is going to be much better. The fact that the R5C is using those small batteries is really going to be a limitation, and there are just so many options for the C70 batteries in size and capacity that you're going to get a much longer runtime for sure. Hasn't been demonstrated yet because we haven't really seen footage as of yet, but I'm assuming that the C70 is probably going to have a lot better rolling shutter. The Super 35 versus full frame aspect of it is going to, obviously dictate that. I think we'll definitely see rolling shutter be better on the C70 if that's something that you need to be concerned with shooting action or moving shots. So let's talk about who do we think the closest competitor is to the R5C. I think it without fail has to be the FX3. Certainly the R5C is going to have this 8K, but who out there is using 8K? I don't know anyone in any industry that's really utilizing 8K right now. It seems like a bit of overkill. I know that when the R5 came out, that was such a selling point, was that they were really pushing the 8K boundaries, and certainly understand other companies like Blackmagic are pushing that boundary as well. But for practical use, I don't know anyone that wants to shoot in 8K, edit and do post-production work in 8K, or deal with the storage requirements of 8K right now. I think the other thing we have to think about is price. The FX3 is coming in at $3,900, and that includes the XLR adapter that comes with that unit. And so, by the time you add on the XLR for this R5C, you're looking at a $5,000 camera unit, and that's before you get into lenses. So I think that's something that price is going to be something that many folks think about. The FX3 also is going to come with S-Log3 and that XLR adapter, and so dynamic range is probably going to be a little bit better in that regard on the FX3 as well. So certainly Canon could come out and do a firmware update and possibly give us C-Log2, but there's that question about, are they really protecting, that cinema line? I do think the R5C has better monitoring tools and obviously 8K, but again, the question is how many people really are using those monitoring tools on the little tiny small displays, or are they actually using an external display that probably has most of those monitoring tools built in? When it comes to things like rolling shutter, we have to assume that the FX3 is probably going to have better rolling shutter, being that it's that smaller 12 megapixel style sensor. Even though it's full frame, we know and have seen that it has good rolling shutter characteristics. Probably is going to stand to reason that the R5C is going to have that rolling shutter problem that we talk about. So the question is it the right camera for you? Well, only you can determine that, but certainly it's great to see camera companies pushing that boundary and releasing cameras that can do great and amazing things. Am I going to consider it? No, I'm not going to consider it. Really, for me, it comes down to cost, the C-Log2 limitation. If you shoot anything outside or in the environments that we shoot in, whether it be commercial or wedding videography, dynamic range is such an important component of it. And so S-Log3 has become one of those things we use all the time now to really maximize that. If they would come out with, the possibility of C-Log2, maybe that would change the consideration. But also I think the other thing is the battery life. I've got great concerns about how long those batteries will last, and I think you're going to be really eating through batteries to use this camera. I also think that convenience factor of having to, have different card types. One of the things I've really appreciated about the FX3 and the A7S III is that ability to use standard SD cards for most of what we record. And 4K 60, 4K 120 tends to be more than adequate for the type of things we're producing. And for the cost associated of storage and all those things, it makes sense. So if you're considering an R5C, maybe these are some things to think about: the good, the bad, and the ugly. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.